You step into a corridor of stone that breathes with the chill of night. The walls drip with damp silence. Yet somewhere beyond the iron doors, muffled laughter trembles like the echo of a forbidden prayer. It is not joyous laughter. It is hushed, secretive, the kind of sound that carries shame in its echo. And here, in this place where power crowns men as gods, every whisper carries the weight of a blade. Kings, men sculpted into symbols of dominion, were, in truth, prisoners of their own hunger. They sat upon thrones encrusted with gold, yet the seat beneath them burned with restlessness. Absolute power did not free them. It chained them tighter to their most dangerous appetites. For what is a crown, if not a cage gilded so finely it blinds the prisoner within? The medieval courts were temples of splendor, chandeliers spilling light like liquid fire, silks brushing the floor with whispers of wealth. But beneath the velvet, rot spread. These courts were theaters where desire masqueraded as ritual, and love was never tender. It was a contract, a gamble, a perilous flame. To touch the forbidden was to dance barefoot upon glass, every step drawing blood unseen by the crowd. Here, passion could elevate a soul to untouchable ecstasy, or drag it down to a ruin so complete that even history hesitated to speak its name. Every stolen glance was a weapon, every hidden kiss a rebellion. And in the echo of that laughter, you sense it already. Intoxicating, yes, but deadly. And so the story begins, not with triumph, but with the shiver of danger. For love in these courts was not salvation. It was the beginning of the end. The crown was never only gold. It was iron hidden beneath the shimmer. A king's life was carved into duty, his heart bartered like a coin in treaties. Marriages were not vows of affection, but contracts inked in bloodlines. Bargains meant to bind kingdoms tighter than steel. The queen beside him was not chosen for desire, but for geography, her smile carrying the weight of borders, her womb a map for the future. And so the monarch played the role the world demanded. At feasts, he held her hand. In churches, he whispered vows rehearsed like prayers. To his people, they were the image of sanctity, the portrait of divine order. Yet behind the veil of ceremony, silence grew louder than music. The bed was cold, the throne colder still. It was beyond these arranged unions that the pulse of real affection often throbbed. A servant's touch, a lady-in-waiting's glance, a knight's loyal devotion. Here was warmth stolen from the margins of power. But secrecy was its price. Behind guarded doors, desire became confession, a fragile defiance against the machinery of dynasties. To be seen was to risk ruin. To be caught was to forfeit not only passion, but life itself. Power made kings visible to the world, but longing made them invisible to themselves. They lived in a theater, their gestures scripted, their words rehearsed. But when night fell, and the laughter behind the iron doors stirred again, masks slipped. The tension between public grandeur and private yearning twisted like a blade turned inward. For in every forbidden embrace, one truth lingered. The throne gave them everything, except the right to love freely. England, early in the 14th century, stone castles rising like teeth against the gray sky, and within them, a silence more cutting than swords. Edward II, crowned by divine right, found his heart ensnared not by his queen, Isabella of France, but by a man who walked into his court like a shadow that glimmered, Piers Gaveston. Their bond was not hidden, it could not be. It burned too brightly, unsettling those who watched. The nobles whispered in corridors lined with banners, their voices thick with venom. To them, Gaveston was no companion, but a contagion. They spat words like curses, calling him a sorcerer over the king, as though enchantment alone could explain why power bent toward him. Grotesque images passed between lips, a monarch bewitched, shackled by desire, his dignity devoured as if by invisible chains. It was easier for them to imagine spells than to face the truth, that the king's love had slipped outside the boundaries of their order. The court became a theater of disgust. To the nobility, Edward's devotion was a humiliation, their own authority mocked by his defiance. They painted Gaveston in monstrous colors, corrupter, seducer, a parasite feasting on the body of England itself. And yet, Behind every insult lay fear, the fear that passion could unmake the architecture of power, that longing could undo centuries of tradition. You hear the laughter behind the iron doors again, but now it is sharper, crueler, the sound of men mocking what they cannot control. Edward's love became not only his solace, but his peril, for in every whispered slander, betrayal was already germinating. Forbidden affection was no longer an echo in the night. It had become a wound in daylight. You stand in the hall of council, where words drip sweeter than honey but sting sharper than steel. Around Edward, the nobles bow, their mouths murmuring loyalty, their eyes polished with false devotion. Yet beneath their robes, the air quivers with the weight of knives. Every oath is a mask. Every smile conceals the hunger of blade. They could not forgive what they called corruption. To them, Gaveston was not merely a favorite. He was an infection that gnawed at the marrow of their power. And so they spoke in whispers, plotting in chambers that smelled of wax and damp parchment. Plutarch once wrote that power reveals the man. Here, it revealed monsters. The nobles dreamed of sacrifice, but not of their own flesh. They would bleed Gaveston as if purging the body of England. Love in such a place was never tender. It was treason. Every embrace between Edward and his companion sealed a prophecy of ruin. What began as devotion became a death sentence written in silence. The king's heart had chosen, but in doing so, it condemned the one he cherished to the cruelty of men who ruled with shadows. You feel it even now, the noose tightening before it ever touches the neck, the betrayal curdling long before the act. Forbidden affection was not merely dangerous, it was fatal. The court itself had become a ritual chamber, and the sacrifice had already been named. For in history's cruel theater, love is often fed to knives before it is ever granted peace. She was called the she-wolf of France, but before the legend, there was only Isabella, a queen whose marriage was inked in treaties, her body pledged to bind two kingdoms together. Yet what she found in Edward's court was not devotion, but absence. Her husband's gaze strayed elsewhere, drawn endlessly to Gaveston, and the queen, young, proud, and watched by all, was left to bear the silence of humiliation. In royal chambers, betrayal cuts deeper than in any peasant's hut. For here, it is not just the heart that breaks, but the architecture of nations. Every slight against Isabella was a slight against France. Every wound to her pride a fracture in the fragile thread of diplomacy. The nobles saw it, whispered of it, savored it. Her humiliation was a performance staged before Europe itself. But humiliation, when tempered in fire, can become a weapon. Isabella learned to wield her suffering like steel. Behind her measured poise, she began to calculate. If the king's love could dishonor her, then her silence could betray him. She became strategist and victim both, her grief sculpted into a mask of resolve. The court mistook her composure for obedience. In truth, it was the patience of a predator. You feel her loneliness like a draft seeping under a locked door, cold, persistent, unyielding. Yet within that cold grew something sharper, resolve. In her bed, she carried not affection but memory of shame. And memory, when sharpened, becomes a blade. The betrayal that had cut her open would, in time, carve England itself. They dragged him into the open, not as a man, but as an offering to their hatred. Piers Gaveston, once draped in silks and laughter, now stumbled in rags, his wrists bound, his body bruised by the weight of betrayal. The air itself seemed to recoil as the nobles closed in, their faces lit not by justice, but by the hunger of cruelty. They would not grant him the dignity of a trial. No throne could shield him now. His crime was not treason, though that was the word they spat. It was love. Love that dared to eclipse their power. Love that made the king human when they demanded him divine. For that, Gaveston would be made spectacle. The execution was no swift mercy. They mocked him, tore from him the vestiges of nobility. His body became canvas for their scorn, stripped, humiliated, broken. The blows fell heavy, Each strike meant not only to end flesh, but to erase memory. They wanted silence, not only from his throat, but from history itself. Yet even in ruin, he remained a mirror of their fear. When the final stroke came, it was less a death than a silencing. His head severed, his body discarded, as if love itself could be beheaded and forgotten. But in the grotesque stillness that followed, you sensed the truth. He had become a martyr, not to faith, but to desire. The nobles feared treason, but they feared passion more. For swords cannot pierce longing, nor can crowns bind it. Gaveston's corpse was their warning and their confession. Love, when forbidden, bleeds in a legend. The corridors that once echoed with Gaveston's laughter grew hollow, like crypts where sound itself refused to dwell. Edward walked among them as a man unmoored, his throne intact, but his heart extinguished. Every tapestry, every gilded chalice, seemed to mock him with silence. The court had triumphed, yes, but what remained was not victory. It was absence, vast and suffocating. You feel in the air the weight of memory. To speak Gaveston's name became treason. To remember his smile was to court suspicion. Even recollection turned poisonous, a forbidden relic carried in secret chambers of the mind. What is left to a man when even memory is outlawed? Only shadows, and the shadows bite. The court became a graveyard of laughter, its rituals reduced to hollow pantomime. Edward still wore the crown, but it pressed against him like a shackle. Behind every ceremony, the nobles' knives gleamed in the silence, reminding him that love had been executed and that his grief was to be hidden as shame. Yet England was not alone in this cruelty. Across Europe, monarchs sat in similar cages, where desire was a ghost that had to be exorcised or punished. In France, in Castile, in the courts of the Holy Roman Empire, the same truth whispered. When love disobeyed the script of politics, it was branded sin, weakness, betrayal. And always, it was smothered in silence. Forbidden love was not merely an English tragedy. It was a European ritual, repeated in castles and palaces, a hidden language carved into the very bones of power. The century turns backward, and the veil lifts to the 12th. Here stands Richard, the Lionheart, warrior, king, crusader. History paints him in steel and fire, but in the dim corners of Chronicles lies another portrait, softer, dangerous, whispered rather than proclaimed. For it is written that Richard of England and Philip II of France shared more than treaties. They shared a bed. The chronicler Roger of Hoveden recorded it plainly. Kings lying side by side, the love between them so strong it seemed to surpass the love of man for woman. Was it alliance? Was it intimacy? Or was it both, inseparable, a flame disguised as diplomacy? Imagine the spectacle. Two monarchs, enemies by blood, rivals by crown, yet bound in secrecy by something stronger than politics. Their nights became scripture for rumor, a sacred scandal inked in silence. Nobles recoiled, priests muttered of sin, but still the image endured. Two kings, their bodies closer than their kingdoms. In that intimacy, the line blurred until no one could say where strategy ended and longing began. Was the treaty at their lips, or was it the kiss itself? In their union, Europe glimpsed the most terrifying truth of all, that power, dressed in armor and banners, could be undone by touch. The Chronicles speak without judgment, but the echo is unmistakable. Richard's sword carved empires, yet in the night he was still a man, haunted, needing, reaching. And it is in that reach that his legend fractures, revealing not just a king of war, but a king of forbidden desire. The church towered above kings, its bells tolling not only for prayer, but for judgment. In a medieval world, it was not the sword alone that ruled hearts. It was the promise of salvation, the terror of damnation. Lovers who strayed beyond the sanctioned path did not only risk exile or death. They were told their very souls would burn. Passion became a doorway, not to joy, but to hell. Priests thundered from pulpits, their words iron, their warnings soaked in fire. A kiss stolen in shadow was preached as sin blacker than murder, for it defied the sacred order. The church cloaked itself in purity, demanding obedience, carving fear into flesh and conscience alike. And yet, behind cloister walls, the same desire pulsed, the same hunger stirred. History whispers of popes who condemned with one hand and caressed with the other. Alexander VI, centuries later, would be notorious for his mistresses and children. But even in these earlier centuries, chronicles murmur of pontiffs and cardinals entangled in beds they swore to renounce. The hypocrisy is as grotesque as it is predictable. Men who painted passion as sin, while secretly drowning in it. The irony rots the air. A peasant's affair could end in the noose. A king's devotion could end in a spear. Yet a pope, clothed in holy vestments, could whisper in darkness and expect silence to protect him. Morality, then, was not divine. It was theater, staged to keep desire chained while power fed itself freely. And so, the lovers who dared defy both crown and cross bore the heaviest curse of all. Not only the threat of execution, but the eternal stain of damnation. Secrecy is not silence. It is a living thing. It breathes in the shadows of corridors, coils itself around whispers, and waits, patient as a predator. In the medieval courts, secrecy fed on desire, growing fat on every stolen glance, every kiss hidden behind stone walls. It was no passive veil. It was a monster, stalking the very heart of power. A treaty signed by daylight could be undone by a touch in darkness. One lover's confession could shift an army. One betrayal could tilt the fate of kingdoms. The lips that brushed together in secrecy carried more weight than the seals of kings. Alliances were not only forged in parchment and ink, but in the trembling moments no chronicle dared record. Yet secrecy devours. It twists affection into danger, transforming devotion into blackmail, loyalty into leverage. A hidden love could bloom into rebellion or collapse into war. Behind every curtain, behind every locked door, secrecy watched, grinning, waiting for the moment it could bare its teeth. You feel its breath in the halls of history, cold, unyielding, omnipresent. It stalked Edward and Gaveston. It lingered between Richard and Philip. It haunted queens and popes alike. Secrecy was not merely a condition of forbidden love. It was the executioner's shadow, the ghost that hovered before the blade ever fell. And in this way, secrecy ruled alongside kings, shaping destinies with claws unseen. A monster not of flesh, but of silence. Scotland, 15th century, stone fortresses rising against skies the color of ash, and within them, the tale of a king whose heart strayed into silence. James I, poet and prisoner of his own crown, found in William Lindsay, his knight, his shadow, a bond whispered more than spoken, felt more than declared. The Chronicles do not preserve it fully. They rarely do. What survives are fragments, poetry bleeding with longing, verses where affection hides beneath metaphors of loyalty and honor. Rumor lingers where ink falters. The court whispered of closeness that exceeded duty, of nights where king and knight shared not only words but silence too heavy, too tender to be explained away. And yet, history itself recoiled. Records thinned, voices fell quiet. What remains are scraps, torn edges of a tapestry once vibrant. But shadows remember. They cling to the margins, carrying echoes the scribes refused to sanctify. James's poetry, veiled and fractured, breathes hints of an intimacy that scandalized those who demanded kings be gods, not men. William Lindsay's name flickers like a candle in a storm, fragile, trembling, but never quite extinguished. The tragedy is not only in what was forbidden, but in what was erased. Love reduced to rumor, devotion buried beneath centuries of silence. It is as if the world conspired to strip their bond of dignity, leaving only a ghostly outline, haunting in its incompleteness. And so, history does what cruelty could not. It erases. Yet in the erasure itself, memory survives. For shadows, once cast, cannot be entirely destroyed. They stood beside the throne, crowned not with freedom, but with expectation. Queens, mistresses, wives, women who bore the weight of dynasties on their bodies, yet whose own desires were shackled in silence. They were the watchers of secrets, condemned to live in the long shadow of forbidden love. Some turned their gaze away, mastering the art of blindness. A queen might pretend not to notice the stolen glances, the midnight absences, the affection poured elsewhere. Her silence was survival, her obedience the only shield against humiliation. She became a statue in silk, her heart beating quietly beneath the stone mask of duty. Others could not endure. Their pain sharpened into vengeance, their humiliation weaponized. Isabella of France endured her husband's devotion to Gaveston, but her silence eventually birthed rebellion. Her grief transformed into strategy. In palaces across Europe, similar stories repeated. Women scorned, plotting in the shadows, their tears drying into daggers. Yet most suffered quietly. Political marriages were cages disguised as crowns. Their bodies were treaties, their children alliances. They lived in rooms heavy with perfume and prayer, while their husbands sought passion elsewhere, sometimes in secret, sometimes in plain defiance. And in those gilded chambers, sorrow lingered like smoke, unspoken yet suffocating. Their tragedy is not always named in Chronicles, for history rarely pauses to honor the silence of women. Yet if you listen closely, you hear it. The ache in forgotten letters, the bitterness etched into chronicles by hostile scribes, the faint echo of lives reduced to obedience. Beside every king's scandal, there was a queen's wound. Beside every forbidden love, a woman's silence, sometimes blind, sometimes vengeful, always bound. In palaces where whispers were sharper than daggers, forbidden love almost always met a violent end. Lovers were not merely separated. They were destroyed, their passion repaid with steel and fire. Beheadings were the crown's favorite theater. Lovers dragged to the scaffold became warnings to all who watched. Desire outside permission would be answered with the fall of an axe. Exile was no gentler. Cast from court, stripped of title, and branded with shame, many vanished into foreign lands where their names dissolved like smoke. Others were erased altogether, their portraits burned, their poems struck from archives, as though love itself could be deleted from memory. Behind these punishments stood the brutal mask of honor. Kings claimed the blood of their wives' companions restored dignity. Brothers justified murder by calling it duty. Fathers silenced daughters with rope or poison, and history called it order. Yet the truth was raw and merciless. Love, untamed, unapproved, was an enemy of power. The horror lies not only in the killings, but in their ritual precision. A kiss could summon the headsman. A glance could bring banishment. To love wrongly was to gamble with your life, and most lost. What survives today are fragments. A letter written in trembling hand before the blade. A rumor of a queen's tears as her lover's body was carried away. These shards remind us that every execution was more than punishment. It was the deliberate murder of intimacy, tenderness, and rebellion. Love was not only forbidden, it was slaughtered. The killings ended lives, but the chronicles murdered memory. What passion survived in whispers was strangled again by ink. Historians, scribes, monks, court poets took what they saw and renamed it. A caress became suspicious behavior. A shared bed became an oath of brotherhood. Intimacy was reduced to sinful friendship, a phrase sharpened not by truth but by fear. Consider the Vita Edwardi Secundi, a chronicle written in the 14th century. Its author wrote that Edward II embraced Piers Gaveston more than was proper, a line heavy with accusation yet deliberately vague, ensuring scandal without confession. Or Derek Vitalis, writing in the 12th century, described nobles who shared beds as unnaturally bound, careful to poison the intimacy without daring to describe it. These men held the power to sculpt memory, and they chose shame as their chisel. The irony is cruel. Love, already hunted by courts and executioners, was hunted again by historians. Not only were lovers killed, their stories were buried beneath euphemism and slander. What should have been remembered as passion or tenderness became recorded as weakness, corruption, sin. This is where history itself becomes a weapon, not a mirror of the past, but a mask. And behind that mask lies shame, carefully crafted so that future generations inherit silence instead of truth. They try to burn the evidence, to bury it beneath ink and shame, yet fragments survived. A torn letter hidden in an archive, a poem scribbled in the margins of a psalter, a rumor carried in the hushed tones of servants. These are the bones of forbidden love that history could not fully erase. From the scattered verses attributed to James I of Scotland, whose lines may have hinted at William Lindsay, to the soft chronicles of troubadours who sang of knights who loved one another as fiercely as they loved their swords, desire flickers through the rubble of censorship. Even kings, with their armies and inquisitors, could not silence the heartbeat of affection that defied law, church, and custom. Is fragile, yes, often nothing more than rumor, a suggestion, a line half erased. But the very survival of these fragments is proof of resistance. Passion has always left traces because it lives in the hands that write, in the voices that whisper, in the shadows that remember when official history chooses to forget. Here lies the paradox. The more the world tried to kill these loves, the more hauntingly they echo through time. Fragments are not weakness. They are scars, and scars endure longer than flesh. In the end, the crowns have turned to dust. The thrones that once shook with laughter, with oaths, with whispers of treachery. Now they stand empty, their stone corridors echoing only with the sigh of centuries. Power rotted, kingdoms fractured, names that once bent nations now lie forgotten in crumbling books. But the kisses remain, not in stone, not in law, not in the chronicles that tried to erase them, but in the air, in the silence, in the shadows where memory lingers. A hand brushed against another in secret, a glance stolen at a banquet, lips pressed together in the dark, trembling with both desire and terror. These are the moments that haunt eternity. You hear them now, if you listen, the faint sound of laughter muffled behind iron doors, the ghost of footsteps pacing where lovers once risked everything. History pretended to kill them, yet their affection is still here, breathing through cracks in the past. And so the story closes not with triumph, but with confession. That love, forbidden and hunted, outlasts the empires that condemned it. That in every candlelit corridor, where shadows lean close, the eternal truth remains. Crowns crumble, but kisses do not die.